You see, they couldn't get him on Form 24 because
The audio's
there had
open.
not been any flash nominations.
Audio is on.
You guys ready?
Yes. Yeah.
Alright. And 3, 2, 1, go.
Hello and welcome to Shaka Extra Time, a show that comes to you live every Tuesday right here on Facebook Live. And joining me in studio is Shaka Sali himself, aka the Kabale Kid. Hello, Shaka.
Hugely terrific. Paul, how are you?
I'm well, thank you.
It's been quite some time since I last saw you.
It's interesting that every week we are talking about Uganda and Kenya.
Very interesting because those two countries seem to be making some democratic news.
Interesting. And a warm welcome to you all our Facebook followers watching us from all over the world. Shaka Extra Time is a place where you get to ask some questions. In fact, Shaka right now is taking your questions. Shaka, let's go straight away to...
This was 24.
Okay, we are live. Okay, good.
See you. Are you guys ready?
Okay, sure.
And let's start when you like.
Yeah, change it.
Okay.
Said you can start when you like.
Okay. Welcome to Shaka Extra Time. I am Paul Ndiho. Shaka Extra Time is a place where Shaka gets to answer your questions every Tuesday. And right now, Shaka is taking your questions. In case you're just joining us, Shaka, we're talking about what's happening in Kenya. And right before I stopped you, you were talking about how there is ambiguity. I'm not a lawyer, but I'm going to try to maybe to pose this question to you. There seems to be ambiguity between the electoral and the constitution. There is a lot of gray area there. So you have petitioners trying to ask court to interpret some of what's going on. For example, they're asking the Supreme Court to clarify whether if a candidate pulls out of the, like Raila had threatened to pull out of this runoff, that the whole process should be stopped, right? But on the other hand, the Constitution is silent about what needs to happen in between. So, your thoughts, Shaka?
I don't know about, of course, the Constitution being silent, but let's face it, the law is the law. And as far as I think I know, Raila has the right to withdraw his name from the ballot, especially when he thinks and feels that the electoral body is not adhering to what the Supreme Court of Kenya demanded, that the IEBC holds a repeat election that meets the laws of Kenya and the Kenyan Constitution. And they're basically talking about a repeat or fresh election. He didn't really have to fill Form 24, so to speak, in order to make sure that he withdrew his name, because the electoral body initially did not, in fact, require that that should be done, because they did not, in fact, try to organize a fresh elections, which would have required nominations and what have you, and therefore going through filling so many different types of forms. So what Raila did really was to write a letter to the IEBC, indicating, of course, that he was not going to be playing ball, especially because the Electoral Commission had not really met what the Supreme Court required it to do, which is to be in a position of organizing a repeat election that would be free, fair, credible, transparent, and verifiable. And in fact, the chairman of the IEBC himself, Wafula Chebukati, is on record last week saying under the circumstances, he cannot guarantee that he could actually deliver that type of election, even though one of the parties, of course, incumbent President Uhuru Kenyatta, who obviously is the flag bearer of Jubilee, says he must go to an election on October 26.
So what kind of runoff are we looking at if the custodian of this election, Mr. Wafula Chebukati, is saying that he cannot guarantee a credible election? Why are we even having this conversation?
Mind you, Paul, it is not in fact a runoff, because a runoff implies that the first election was in fact legit. But the Supreme Court...
to be corrected.
Yeah, but the Supreme Court, by annulling the August 8th election, indicated in a way, really, that you could, in fact, have considered that particular event on August 8th as not having taken part at all. So the Supreme Court, in fact, required a repeat presidential election or a fresh election.
What will happen on Friday, supposing we don't have an election on Thursday?
If you don't have an election on Thursday, it means that incumbent President Uhuru Kenyatta will stay in office, according to the Constitution, up to November 1st. After November 1st, you run into what some observers would call a constitutional crisis, meaning you go to the Kenyan pecking order and you definitely invoke a transitional government lasting several months, and this probably would be headed by the president, or rather the speaker of the Kenyan National Assembly, who would be J.B. Muturi.
Interesting. Let's go to a comment from Rwanda. It's also about Kenya. Kamlasi John from Rwanda wants to know whether Raila will have power to start a civil war in Kenya after the election runoff, or will his supporters, Raila's supporters, join him to unseat President Uhuru Kenyatta? That is, if the election goes ahead and Uhuru is declared the winner.
I don't understand really the question. I mean, how can you say Raila to have a right to begin a civil war?
So, no, this person is asking whether Raila can mobilize his supporters maybe to cause a massive uprising against the regime.
First of all, I think that we shall cross that bridge when we get there. But before perhaps we do that, we could probably talk about how, for example, if in fact there is no election on 26 October, as we said earlier, there should be a transitional, temporary government, whatever you may want to call it, and that transitional temporary arrangement would have the powers under the Constitution to organize a repeat presidential election in which, of course, President Uhuru Kenyatta, Raila Odinga, and others would be free to participate. If, on the other hand, there is an election on October 26, I am sure that Raila and his supporters will go again to the Kenyan judiciary. They will go to the Supreme Court, and hoping that the Supreme Court would probably once again honor that particular event. Because don't forget that when annulling the August 8th election, the Supreme Court said an election is not simply an electoral event that occurred on August 8th. Rather, it is a process. And in fact, they required the IEBC to go through a democratic process, create an environment in which, again, they would conduct an election that would be free, fair, transparent, credible, and verifiable.
Shaka, some of your fans want you to put this in context for them, the Kenyan situation in context. And one of your fans is looking at the examples of the other countries in the region. For example, in Uganda, in Rwanda, or in Tanzania, you cannot have the sort of election that we are seeing, or the sort of process where an election is held and the Supreme Court overrules and calls for a fresh election. You cannot see that kind of scenario. So maybe to help your viewers or to help your followers understand, can you put that into context for them?
First of all, I think that ideally, in some of the countries, you actually could have that type of election or that type of kind of process. But it would have to happen simply because the Constitution, for example, calls for it, facilitates for it. In the case of Uganda, I know that, and you know also that the Constitution facilitates for it. You have had a situation, for example, where people have gone to the courts. Basically, for example...
But the courts are not independent.
Precisely, but it is about the composition, for example, of the Supreme Court. In the case of Kenya, you do not have a Supreme Court that owes its allegiance to the executive, because it is actually, the members are publicly recruited. And once they do the interviews and are recruited, they go to the National Assembly, and once the Assembly endorses them, the President has no choice but to sign. In the case of Uganda, for example, or in the case of Rwanda or a lot of other countries, the members of the Supreme Court or the Constitutional Court, or whichever level of courts and what have you, are essentially appointed really by the President, by the incumbent President. And therefore, to a certain degree, they probably don't have sufficient room to maneuver in terms of being really, quote-unquote, courageous, being, quote-unquote, independent-minded and all that kind of stuff. In the case of Tanzania, the law does not provide, for example, for a loser to petition to the court. Rather, you petition, in fact, to the Electoral Commission itself. That's part of the problem. And the reason I think people are talking about Kenya, frankly, is because it's kind of like unprecedented. Not only in the region, really, of East Africa, but generally in the continent and probably beyond, really. There are very few cases even in the world, probably not before from the last time I checked, when in fact you have a government in power, an incumbent president, winning an election, and his own Supreme Court or court actually deciding to annul the election because the laws and the Constitution was not or were not met.
Let's cross over to another hotspot. That's Uganda. Uganda is becoming a hotbed of like terror. The government is terrorizing its people along the lines of this age limit thing. You see police firing bullets everywhere. Police is killing, indiscriminately killing civilians, unarmed civilians, all in the name of not wanting these people to exercise their God-given rights, freedom of speech or freedom of expression. Talk to me about what we've been seeing in Uganda.
Uganda is a very interesting case because obviously you do have an amendment, a constitutional amendment, pretty much around the corner because the incumbent president would like a certain important article in the Constitution amended so that he can, in fact, be eligible to run next time around. We're talking about, by the way, 2021. This man looks very, very far, really, because they do have an age cap, and apparently they had actually decided to arrive at an age 75. And very interestingly, apparently that particular age cap was in fact meant to lock out a former Ugandan president by the name Dr. Apollo Milton Obote, because the incumbent president, Yoweri Museveni, feared him so much that if that man were probably to be president in Uganda and showed that his intention is to run for that particular office, he could beat him. And he didn't want to, that kind of environment or circumstance to happen. So they decided to, in fact, make it part of the Constitution, which probably means Uganda doesn't really have a Constitution. It actually has a personal manifesto, a Yoweri Museveni manifesto. Whatever he wants, he must get. Because let's face it, he has even said, when it comes to oil, he says, it is my oil. When it comes to the military, he says, it is my army. When it comes to money, he says, it is my money. So it is your country. One of these days, in fact, he might even turn around and say, you, Paul Ndiho, you belong to him.
But Shaka, let me push back on that. As a matter of fact, Uganda has a constitution, but it's just that maybe as all constitutions, it's a working document. You are allowed to go in and change it whenever you feel like it. But maybe perhaps the manner in which they are doing it is not the right way. That said, let's stay in Uganda. Let's go to Charles Watam in Uganda, who said, is it strategically is this age limit thing being strategically used to water down, for example, the arrest of Dr. Chiza Besigye and his supporters? Is it a strategy to water down this debate, the ongoing debate on the lifting of age limit?
First of all, it is very interesting that you use the word debate. Debate implies that there are at least two people or at least more than one individual who are basically talking or debating, comparing notes about an issue. But in this particular case, even though the rhetoric suggests that there is a debate, in fact, there is no debate. There is only one side of those people who actually side with the amendment to go out and canvass, or sell their message and what have you, mobilize people around that idea. In fact, those particular people have not only been provided by security whenever it is necessary, they have even been given money. Each member of parliament who supports the amendment, from what I saw, has actually been paid to his or her account at least $8,000 US.
Well, that's a lot of money. It can make a big difference.
Very interesting.
People, right?
And yet, the other people who do not have access to that type of money, who do not have access to that type of security, they get a lot of people, for some reason, the people seem to believe in them. And now, because of that, the people who support the amendment and the government have decided that probably the people, in fact, are their enemy. That is probably why you talked about reports suggesting that they are shooting some of them. In fact, there is an incident in your hometown of Rukunjiri where they actually killed an individual. And that also reminds me, by the way, back in 2001, there was also another individual in that particular town that was shot in the name of democracy, because a man called Dr. Chiza Besigye was actually pulling large crowds, huge crowds, drawing traction to the extent that the president did not really feel comfortable. And so, let's face it, unfortunately what is going on and the manner in which it is going on suggests that the president and his people no longer look at the people as their allies, no longer look at their people as their masters, as they often say. They probably look at them right now, as somebody suggested, as enemies really. And therefore, that is probably the reason why the MPs have actually been encouraged not necessarily to go and interact with people, interact with masses of the people, but rather they should go and consult with hand-picked leaders in certain communities about the issue.
You mentioned the name Kizza Besigye, and I see some Facebook followers here sending us messages about Kizza Besigye. They say the Ugandan government or the police is using the law to break the law. For example, this is a guy who got arrested last week. He hasn't been produced in court, and they're still holding him. It's been over 48 hours. He has not had a right to an attorney. He has not had a right to appear in court. What do you say about that?
That is precisely because I said some time back earlier that Uganda does not have a constitution. It actually has a constitution in name. But beyond that, you're talking about a Yoweri Museveni manifesto. Because if in fact that particular individual who sent that message is correct, that under the law, that shouldn't happen. So why is it happening when in fact you cannot justify it under the Constitution? That's because, let's face it, at the end of the day, the people who are in the government, they control, the three branches of government. They control the judiciary system, they control the legislature, they control the executive, and they control the other, the military and what have you and stuff like that. And so they are in a position, in fact, to decide who should be protected by the law and who should not be protected by the law. And I think that is in fact what is happening in practice. When you question some of these police officers, and some of these police officers, Paul, by the way, they're very highly educated. In fact, some of them, you can't believe it, have law degrees from Makerere and what have you.
Including their boss.
That is true.
The chief of police has a law degree.
Even a master's degree to boot, in fact, from the London School of Economics. We're talking about General Kare Kehura. But the thing is, when you ask some of these individuals, how dare you do ABC? They will say, orders from above. Orders from above. So is that the constitution you're talking about?
I don't know. Let's cross over to Zambia. Let's go to Shamahel Kakoma in Zambia. Wants to know if you think it's because of weak governance institutions that democracy is failing in Africa.
Oh yeah, I couldn't agree with that particular individual more. And let's face it, part of the issue is that there is bad governance. There's bad governance on the ground, and there is definitely no democracy. If democracy is there, it is questionable democracy, because democracy, frankly, calls for a society that has people who enjoy the freedoms of expression, the freedoms of assembly, the freedoms of association. In other words, when you talk about freedom, you're talking about somebody, frankly, having a birthright to be a human being, a birthright to have the opportunity to do whatever they can want to do under the laws of that particular country or that particular community. But in this particular case, the type of democracy that we have, unfortunately, is probably a government of some people, by some people, and for some people. certainly not for every citizen.
We still have time for a couple more comments. Let's go to Kaba Musa in Liberia. He would like to know, how far do you think Liberia's democracy has come, given the example of the previous elections that were held peacefully, and they're heading into a runoff?
It is very interesting because, in fact, I will inform that particular individual that the last time that Liberia experienced what you would call peaceful democratic transition, or peaceful transition of power from one individual to another individual, is 70 years ago. 70. Would you believe that? Not even Ghana, the first country in Black Africa, had actually regained its political independence from Britain. That's the last time. So I think there is a significant improvement, at least during the last 12 years. There are a lot of people, of course, who complain that even though Ellen Johnson Sirleaf won a Nobel Peace Prize and what have you, and has actually been in power, that it wasn't really because she's very democratic, that she had a lot of weaknesses here and there, and for the most part, security really was being provided by the United Nations peacekeeping forces and what have you. But I think there are some very important steps that Liberia has been able to walk democratically under President Sirleaf, and that is why, of course, we went through the first round. We don't have people quarreling or complaining as so much as in Kenya, for example, and I'm sure that we have a guarantee of a second round next month.
Shaka, what are you talking about tomorrow on Straight Talk Africa?
We are talking about the politics of Kenyan repeat presidential elections.
Interesting. I think we still have, maybe very briefly, somebody wants you to talk about the terrorism in North Africa, especially in light of the attacks that happened where 4 Americans were killed and several other. Yeah,
let's face it, it's very unfortunate that the 4 Americans were killed, but let's be honest, there are so many people whose lives are being lost in that particular region and beyond. And that kind of life, frankly, shouldn't be, looked upon as that cheap. I think that it is very unfortunate that the powers that be, wherever they are, instead of, frankly, identifying what I would consider to be the fundamental root causes of what they call terrorism so that they can adequately address them, they seem to be, in fact, addressing symptoms.
Well, Shaka, on that note, thank you so much. But before I finish, for those people who are on the streets in Kenya, people who are on the streets in Uganda fighting for democracy, maybe let me end with a Nelson Mandela quote who once said that courage is not the absence of fear, but triumph over it. The brave man is not the one who does not feel afraid, but who conquers the fear. So to those guys who are on the streets soldiering out, keep going for so long. Nice to be here. Thank you so much, Shaka.
And let's keep hope
alive.
alive.